Good morning. I'm Ivo Dollar, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, a weekly look at the week's news from around the world. And joining us today is Carol Giacomo, the editorial board of the New York Times. Carol, wonderful to have you back again.
Thanks, Ivo.
And also with us is Stefan Kornelius, the foreign editor of the 𝑍𝑒𝑖𝑡𝑢𝑛𝑔'𝑠 Zeitung. Stefan, great to have you again.
Hello, Ivo. Good to see you.
And at Luce, the U.S. national editor of the Financial Times. Wonderful to have you back as well, Ed.
Great to be here, Ivo.
Well, lots of things to discuss, but let's start with, I think, the biggest story, which is Hong Kong and the decision by the Chinese government to have new legislation to allow the Chinese government directly to interfere in the affairs of Hong Kong. And what the U.S. and the world reaction to that really remarkable step is. Ed, where did this come from? What is it that the Chinese National People's Legislature has decided, and what do you see as some of the issues that arise from it?
Well, thanks, Ivo, for inviting me on again. Always a pleasure. This comes from a very insecure place. From China's point of view. The Hong Kong people, as you know, way before the coronavirus, this time last year, were protesting very heavily against local Hong Kong legislature's attempts to push through Chinese extradition law into the Hong Kong legal system, and they backed down. The protests, wearing masks, interestingly enough, so that they couldn't be identified, got up to 1 million people at one point. It was an extraordinary show of defiance against China and against Xi Jinping's alleged breach of the one country, two systems framework for Hong Kong. Then coronavirus hit. Hong Kong's handled it pretty well. China initially handled it pretty badly, but now believes that it's got ideological bragging rights, given how disastrous many Western countries disastrously they've handled it. And so I think he felt, under the cover of COVID-19, this was a good moment to smuggle into Hong Kong law Chinese state security law, to break the one country, two systems agreement negotiated by the British that lasts for 50 years, from 1997 to 2047, to bypass the Hong Kong legislature, which has once before tried to do this. It's tried to put anti-subversion laws on the books, Chinese-style anti-subversion laws on the books, and was forced to back down in an earlier wave of protests in 2003. And I think Xi Jinping felt this was a good moment simply just to put it on Hong Kong's books via a little-known provision in the basic law that could bypass the Hong Kong legislature altogether. It's a very dangerous moment. He's essentially poking the Hong Kong protesters with a stick, and daring them basically double or quits, doubling down. And he has managed, Xi Jinping that is, with this act to unite the West. A very rare statement of condemnation, including Britain, the United States, Australia, and others that have been at loggerheads recently on China. He's united the West, and quite probably united the Hong Kong people too.
Carol, Ed rightly mentioned that there was this statement that the U.S. issued together with the governments of Britain, Australia, I believe Canada. We've also seen statements coming from the Europeans. Is this the moment when multilateral diplomacy and effective American leadership is evident, because we're now seeing more and more people trying to get this issue addressed together, or is that, or are we seeing something different?
You know, pardon me if I'm a huge skeptic about this. I think Xi Jinping, this has been a long-term goal of his to, completely exercise Beijing's control on all the disparate parts of China that he considers one China. And, you've got the world consumed really with their domestic responses to this coronavirus. You have a a European Union that is not really that strong and united. You've got a Britain, and Britain has a particularly big stake in this outcome because it was Britain that handed over Hong Kong to China in 1997. I was there actually at that moment, and there was great hope that China would adhere to its commitments. And also at that moment, the British and the Americans were very sort of fulsome in their statements of commitment to guarantee that Hong Kong would be able to maintain its autonomy under the Chinese system. But you've got a weak American leader. You've got a British leader who has his own problems. You've got a Europe that, thank goodness they made a statement that pulled them all together. But whether this actually matters in the end, I prove it.
Stefan, how has this been received in Europe? Clearly, Europe has had differences over the issue of China, but the last few months also has seen widespread skepticism about the Chinese in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. How is it looking from where you are?
Yeah, let me actually bring this a bit further. What Carol said is quite true, and we saw this afternoon in Europe here just 2 hours ago that the foreign ministers convened in a virtual meeting, and they issued a statement which was as vague or as undetermined as you could believe. They was just sort of voicing their deep concern on developments in Hong Kong. This is far from the cries you hear from Washington and from actually the British, the Canadians, and the Australians, which had a unified message on this. The British were actually, for the first time since they left the European Union, leaving the coordinated foreign policy mechanisms, which they still join sort of officially, and which is a statement in itself. The Chinese were playing on Europe yesterday very heavily. The French foreign policy advisor to Macron, Bonn, had a phone conversation with Xi Jinping and with the Chinese foreign minister, and the Chinese foreign ministry issued a statement after this and praising France for not intervening in their Chinese problems and trying to separate France from the European Union. The LSE, in the aftermath, had to counter that statement, had to publish, had to issue a pretty harsh condemnation on Twitter 2 hours later. So that shows that Europe is deeply divided over it. That all comes on the background of this huge EU-China summit, which is planned for September under the German EU presidency, where basically the EU was planning to set up its own strategy towards China, which was quite distinguished to what the Trump administration is doing right now. I'm not sure, actually, I'm pretty convinced that Europe will fail at this. They will not be strong and united enough to come up with a separate policy. And this, in the end, will put especially Germany to a huge test. Merkel has to decide whether her pretty cozy relation with China over the past 15 years is sustainable or whether she has to change course. And I know from talking to the actor, to the people involved in this, that they are pretty hard arguing right now on what the right path would be, but they think they do still have a couple of weeks or even months until September when this China-EU summit will take place.
But Ed, we are weeks away from the G7 meeting, whether in person or virtual. Or the president would like to have it in person in Camp David. We'll see whether that in fact happens. Hong Kong is going to have to be on the agenda, and 3 of the members have already made clear where they stood in the statement that we said. But now the Italians and the Germans and the French will have to decide how they're going to react. And at the same time, it seems to me the U.S. is going to continue to take steps. Pompeo has already made a first step to lay the basis for sanctions and to lay the basis for a change in policy. If you were to predict, where are we going to be 3 weeks from now when the G7 comes together in terms of what the U.S. has already done and how this might play out?
Right. One interesting, to pick up on what the other two were saying, one interesting tale within a tale here is the degree to which Britain has shifted. Britain very much had been the most mercantilist in its approach towards China for many years now, rolling out the red carpet for Xi Jinping, refusing to drop Huawei from its 5G network, and going very soft on the Uyghur issue and human rights questions. Britain seems to, in the last few weeks, have quite sharply moved towards the more hawkish Pompeo American position. It's now looking at dropping Huawei over time. It's offered 300,000 visas to Hong Kongers, 12-month visas that can be converted into citizenship, which is quite notable for what is otherwise a pretty anti-immigration government under Boris Johnson. Insofar as whether the socially distanced, or socially crowded Camp David G7 meeting happens that Trump wants to happen, and where Hong Kong will be by then, look, I don't think the world is going to be able to stop China from imposing Chinese state security law in Hong Kong. Equally, though, I don't think that China is going to be able to stop Hong Kong from protesting very strenuously against it. And this is going to be a massive public relations disaster for Xi Jinping, or at least it risks that, at a time when his legitimacy at home has been more under question than ever before, mostly because of his early handling of coronavirus. So it's a very, very interesting context for the G7 summit, virtually or in person, to be taking place. And the one other sort of contextual dimension that's worth stressing is that Trump is blaming China for America's pandemic disaster, obviously to divert blame from himself. So Sinophobia is going to be a very, very key element of his re-election campaign.
Carol, I just want to stay with Hong Kong for a minute on this issue, and in particular, if Ed's projection of a significant public outrage in Hong Kong expressed in terms of large-scale demonstration is true by the time we get to Camp David, real or virtual, on the G7, do you think the U.S. has the capacity to marshal the other G7 members towards a common position, and then a sort of common action that they can take?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, Trump himself has been schizophrenic about China. I mean, at the moment, this moment of sort of anti-China sentiment in the United States is not a new thing. This has happened before during the Bill Clinton election. There was a tendency to sort of use China as a battering chopping block, or whatever you want to call it. And there have been other moments when that's happened too, because China is a rising power and it's been a convenient whipping boy. And now, so Trump is in a place where, yes, he's blaming China. On the other hand, he has this trade deal with China that is one of the few foreign policy, maybe the only foreign policy progress he can cite. Biden will make this an issue as well in the campaign. So the extent to, Trump is a leader, Pompeo is a leader. They don't really have a lot of credibility with the world community these days. So I think it's going to be a heavy lift for them to. They may get a statement. Will they get actual coordinated actions that would be able to actually force Xi Jinping to rethink what he's doing? I don't know. I mean, a lot of American companies, a lot of international companies will pay a price if sanctions are imposed on Hong Kong. There are political pressures from all sides.
Let me take it a step further, actually, if I may. I don't see any willingness from the European side to back Trump on this too soon. Trump is seen as scapegoating China for his other problems. The corona policy he's playing with China from European, especially from Berlin points of views, is far too overstretched. The Wuhan virus thing is definitely something which is politicized. Also, mostly their laboratory issue, but also blaming China on also sort of deliberately letting this virus go. I mean, we can talk about delaying informing the world community on this, and we talk about a few days, and we all know the reason why that happened in China, for fear, for regional policy issues, so on and so forth. So there is not much willingness on the European, especially the German side, to side Trump on this. And so he seems to overcompensate on his corona problems with China. And even though the Chinese are now giving all opportunities or reason to rally against the Hong Kong issue, the Wuhan, the corona issue is balancing this a little bit. And the overall issue in the end will be how much joint policy is there possible, thinkable, with the United States basically being in campaign mode and probably sort of a changing government or not, we don't know. But I don't see that much willingness. Also, from the other side, I don't see Pompeo trying to coordinate on what he's doing with the Europeans. So we don't have any kind of jointness here. I wouldn't expect it until the G7 happens.
So from one issue where there is a division in the international community, let's go to the next issue, which is the EU trying to figure out how we can respond to the extraordinary economic crisis that results from the COVID pandemic. Major movements in the last few days, Stefan. One, an announcement made by President Macron and Chancellor Merkel for a 500 euro instrument of potential grants, and then by the EU Commission President von der Leyen, a 750 billion euro fund that would incorporate the 500 billion and add to a strengthening of European and EU institutional capacity to deal with this crisis. And yet we're seeing other countries saying, we're not paying for this, whether it's the Dutch or others. And so how do you see this, on the one hand, extraordinary movement in a way that Macron and others have been pushing for many, many years on strengthening the centrality of the EU, and yet the continuing divisions within the Union that exist on this issue, even with Britain gone?
I mean, there are tons of issues in this, and as you say, it's a truly historic change, mostly in the German government position, which was never prepared to give so much power to the Commission and so much money. Now Merkel has changed her mind, and the idea to team up with Macron to propose these 500 billion is almost historic. It changes the equation, mostly because the powerhouses in Europe now have made their point, and it will be very hard by those smaller countries, mostly the Dutch and the Austrians, which voiced opposition preliminarily, but they're changing tone. They're toning down on this already, to stand up and to stop it. The interesting part in all of this is what comes with the proposal. It is mostly a package which would give the EU a lot of money for fresh programs, mostly green programs, environmental things, technological leapfrogs, also money which would be linked to democratically fair behavior, which on the flip side would leave Poland and Hungary probably out of the recipient's corner. So here we have a lot of proposals which we debated in the EU for the last 15, 20 years, coming all together now, which would have to be decided within weeks, being very close to treaty changes, which is sort of the holy grail of the EU, because you never can get it through. And all of this on top of an already existing 1.1 trillion EU budget, which also has to be decided on. So we are talking big money, and we are talking a huge fundamental shift towards more centrality. and more Commission power, which probably would not have been thinkable without Ursula von der Leyen, the German Commission president, now being in charge, being a close ally of Merkel. And probably not possible without Merkel knowing that she will leave the whole show in a year's time, and she wants to leave a kind of impression when she goes. If this all will be implemented properly, if it helps, we don't know yet. And it's a bit of negotiation, but I think it will take place. There will be a decision by the end of the summer, I guess August, September, and then it will go to parliaments. It definitely is sort of a message to the world that Europe stands up and wants to get out of this Corona thing, somehow not totally shattered.
Ed, how do you see this playing out? I mean, this could be a pivotal moment, truly pivotal moment for Europe if it succeeds to take that next leap forward in terms of its integration. Presumably, if it fails, real questions are going to be raised about what is the EU good for, and how do you is that the right way to look at this? And if so, where would you place your bets?
It's a very good question. I wouldn't put huge amounts of money either way. What I'd say is I think that the wounds from how the Eurozone handled the 2008-2009 crisis, which left a lot of disaffection, I think understandably, in the so-called Club Med countries like Italy and Spain, those wounds now have some opportunity to be addressed by Merkel's quite dramatic gesture this week in joining Macron. She has, I think, single-handedly changed the weather by doing this. Only a German chancellor could, because Germany, of course, is really the most important economic and monetary power. Whether it's going to work or not, and whether it will eventually turn into what they call a Hamiltonian moment, whereby Europe mutualizes its debts, its government's debts, and so Germany would stand behind Italian public debt. Whether it gets there, I'm a bit more skeptical about. The Hamilton moment, of course, was in 1791, I think, when Alexander Hamilton assumed the debts, the assumption of the state debts, and really made America a federal system by doing that, a centralizing act, in other words. If this is the beginning of a road to which you are getting mutualization of European debt, then this will be seen as even more significant moment than we're giving it to it now. I think there's going to be a lot of roadblocks between here and there. I don't think Merkel sees her action as leading to that outcome. I think she hopes this will be enough. This 750 billion euros of 500 billion in grants, 250 billion in loans. This will be enough to placate the Italians and others, but it shows European solidarity, but not too much for the so-called frugal four that Stefan was mentioning, the Austrians, the Dutch, the Danish, one other, I forget which the other is, maybe Sweden, of course, Sweden. It's a positive development, though, in the context of what we might have been discussing 2, 3, 4 weeks ago. It's definitely a step forward and a very significant moment.
You know, I have a question. I'm curious about this, the democratic element of this, and the idea that Hungary and Poland may get less or may get cut out of this entirely because of their political trajectory. Is that real? I mean, the Europeans have been so reluctant, it seems, to take any serious, action against those two countries for their path away from the democratic values that are supposed to sort of undergird this whole process. So anyway, are they going to be cut out significantly or at all?
If I may say a word on this, I doubt it. That's one of the big planks in this program. And I tell you, this proposal of the Commission has so many planks right now, which need to be filled. The allocation of the amounts of money. Why is it that Italy gets such amounts, Spain the other part? The question on how to administrate it. This is a lot of money, but we know from previous programs that a lot of European money is pretty lost in sort of on the way to to the recipients. There's a lot of red tape, mostly also in the southern states. So the question on debt mutualization, which Ed rightfully pointed to, this will come up. There will come up a lot of legal challenges to it, and mostly the question of sort of linking it to democratic values. How do you judge it? How do you rate it? Who's determining on what's right, what's wrong? There might be a way now to put added pressure on things, and sort of the inner core of the EU will feel much more bold now. And EU said that yes, that might be the step to the next level of sort of the federalization of the European Union. But right now, we just see a big ton of money, not more or not less.
So money talks, though, so it's interesting to see how that is going to be used. One place that where money is playing a role as well, Carol, is Libya. In fact, it's oil that is playing a role. We haven't heard a lot about Libya, but there's been now a civil conflict going on. And in the last week, we've seen interventions openly by major other powers, including Russian airplanes being part of the conflict there. What's happening in Libya, and why should we care?
Well, Libya, like a lot of foreign policy or a lot of international issues, has sort of fallen off the page in America anyway, because there's so much focus on coronavirus. But Libya's civil war has become increasingly internationalized, complicated, and dangerous since the warlord Khalifa Haftar and his so-called Libyan National Army launched an offensive against the UN-recognized government in April of 2019. And it's not wrong to see echoes of serious civil war in this conflict. On Tuesday, as you indicated, the Pentagon accused Moscow of sending at least 8 fighter jets to Libya to bolster Haftar's and the Russian-linked mercenaries that are helping him. Russia denied the move, but it would represent a significant expansion of its role in the escalating war. And this follows the intervention of Turkey, which became significantly more involved in Libya last November when it agreed to provide military support to the government in Tripoli. And in exchange, Turkey apparently secured a bilateral pact legitimizing its vast offshore territorial claims in the energy-rich Eastern Mediterranean. For more than a year, there was a stalemate between Haftar and the government, but that now seems to have broken. In fact, last week, a string of victories by Turkish-backed forces dealt a heavy blow to Haftar's troops and raised the possibility that Ankara's involvement in the war could ultimately be decisive. For the moment, the fear is that these two developments, the intervention of Russia and Turkey, are emboldening both sides to intensify their fighting and reject peace negotiations despite Libya grappling with the coronavirus pandemic. The country is awash with arms, mercenaries, and arms smugglers, even though it is under a UN arms embargo. And it's one of those wars where you need to have a scorecard in order to tell the players. The government has Turkey on its side. Haftar has Russia, the UAE, Egypt, France, and various others. The United States, which during the 2011 Arab Spring was involved in the NATO military operations that led to the overthrow of Gaddafi, is now mostly sitting on the sidelines and sending unhelpful mixed signals. While the United States officially supports the government in Tripoli, President Trump has expressed support for Mr. Haftar, and last year, senior officials in his administration effectively greenlighted Mr. Haftar's assault on Tripoli. And many analysts are concerned, and many regional actors are concerned, that America's detachment will make it harder to negotiate a peace settlement in Libya and to protect Western energy and security interests. In a more normal world, American leadership in pushing a peace settlement could be valuable. But at this moment, Mr. Trump seems to show neither the interest nor the skills to undertake that responsibility. So everything's up for grabs.
A complicated situation that I think is playing out in so many different dimensions. But let's focus for a second, Ed, on sort of the international dimension. This has all the makings of being another great game, just as Afghanistan was and Syria was, and now you have Turkey and Russia again on opposite sides as they were in Syria, even though Erdogan and Putin are pretty closely tied in other ways. How do you see this playing out? And then, Stefan, I'm going to come to you to see what the Europeans care deeply about this because it's right on their borders to say how they're playing it. But Ed, how do you see the great game part of this playing out?
This great game is a little bit different from earlier great games in the Middle East in that there's much more of a vacuum now. America's presence in the Middle East is less secure, less durable. Trump, of course, has withdrawn from Syria, then partially not withdrawn from Syria. He's itching to get out. He's putting out from Afghanistan, not technically the Middle East, but he's uninterested in the region except insofar as, he can get Saudi arms sales and I guess signal to the evangelical vote back here in terms of the Israel-Palestine issue. So this is a bit of a vacuum. America is not playing a big restraining role here. Russia, therefore, as it did in Syria after 2011, is seeing in Libya an opportunity for geopolitical expansion. There might also be, energy sort of dimensions to its interest in Libya. But I think first and foremost, Putin is seeing this as an opportunity to expand Russia's footprint beyond Syria. And Putin is nothing if not a skilled opportunist. There are Russian mercenaries in Libya. These Russian jets that have been arriving there are being sort of very quickly repainted en route in Syria and then getting there. It's not much attempt to disguise Russia's escalating defense of Khalifa Haftar. On the other side, Turkey, as you say, Erdogan and Putin are getting along in other respects, but here they're on opposing sides. And Turkey has its own geopolitical, but also gas exploration interests. The UN-backed government, which Turkey is behind, has offered Turkey some exploration rights in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Gulf states are mostly with Russia on the Haftar side, with the exception of Qatar, which of course is the odd one out in the Gulf, and they're with the Turks. It's got the makings of more than just a great game. It's a real mess, and messes tend to get exported. So it is a pity there is such a vacuum here. America could be playing a more stabilizing role. Don't see much prospect of that.
So, Stefan, the Europeans do care deeply about what's happening in Libya. It's just across a few miles away from EU territory in Malta. The Germans hosted a peace conference earlier in the year in the hope that would finally resolve the issue. It didn't, as we can now see, but also the Europeans, other than the French, who seem to be supporting Haftar, have been absent. Can they fill the vacuum? And if so, how would that happen?
I don't see that right now. I mean, the attempt was there with that peace summit in Berlin to patch over the differences, especially between Italy and France, and then between the war parties in Libya themselves. But the keys are, and Ed and Kara both said it, the key is in Istanbul or Ankara and in Moscow. There we have two leaders who are domestically weakened due to Corona. Putin is especially weakened now since he basically tried to turn this 2020 into a sort of a triumphal year for himself, assuring his establishing new powers for him to remain in office for a while. And now his economy, as the Turkish one, is in free fall. This is where Europe's leverage lies. This is where actually the opportunities are, because there can be pressure on Turkey and on Russia. They are depending on Europe being open, sending tourists, engaging in trade. And if Europe would have the energy and the jointness to put some pressure there, I think they could do a lot of easing of tension in Libya. But right now, I don't see the energy. I don't see the players who take the opportunity. Everyone is preoccupied with the other major issues.
Ed, I think one of the common themes that we've just on the three topics we talked about is that a lot of leaders are looking for excuses, or ways to divert attention away from their own failures when it came to COVID, whether it's Xi in Hong Kong, Trump and China, and as Stefan just reminded us, Erdogan and Putin looking for ways out. You wrote a piece in I believe in Swamp Notes a few days ago about can we come to a conclusion that the type of regimes that exist in the world have an impact on how well we have responded to the corona virus outcome. You tell us a little bit about how should we think about it? Does it matter who leads in order to have a decision, an outcome that is either positive or negative when it came to the pandemic?
I think that leadership matters a lot, and this pandemic, I think, has brought out the different qualities of different leaders. And you think of two ends of the same spectrum: Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who's been very consistent in her public communications, has listened to the scientists, has shown great empathy with the restrictions imposed on people, and admitted very clearly when she doesn't know something, or when the scientists don't know something, what she doesn't know. That builds trust. And trust, I think, is absolutely key to management of a pandemic, because after all, management of a pandemic is getting people to behave, in persuading them it's in their interests to behave in a certain way. At the other end of the spectrum, you have leaders like Donald Trump and Brazil's Bolsonaro, who've been blowing hot and cold, when in Bolsonaro's case, purely cold on this issue, entirely skeptical that this is as big a threat as the scientists make it out to be, pretty anti-scientific in their public pronouncements, prone to magical thinking. I don't need to rehearse the sort of hydroxychloroquine and disinfectant Hail Marys that Trump's indulged in. Bolsonaro even more so. And in fact, Brazil is actually pushing hydroxychloroquine, the anti-malarial drug, through the Brazilian health system as a remedy, in spite of the fact that you can die from taking it. And there's very little evidence to show that it stops you from developing the disease. Who has done well in response to the coronavirus? Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, most of the Nordics, minus Sweden. Germany has done relatively well. New Zealand, as I mentioned, Canada has done well. Generally speaking, the countries that have done well, whether you call them liberal democracies or more managed democracies, are ones where there is quite a high degree of trust in government. And I think it's no accident that the two of the worst cases in the world, in terms of per capita mortality and in terms of shortage of PPE and other equipment, have been Britain and the United States, where politics is so toxically mistrustful nowadays. Italy, of course, is another. Italy's always been like that, so perhaps no surprise there. But I think if you had to summarize, it's trust in what you are told. We don't believe what we're told in places like America and Britain. We have substantial minorities who won't believe there is a real vaccine if and when the vaccine comes out, who will refuse to take it because they'll think it's, I don't know, a plot by Bill Gates to inject microchips into their bloodstream. There is a profound distrust in some democracies, and I think it's no coincidence that they're ones that have performed pretty badly since this pandemic took off.
Stefan, of course, you live in a country where the trust in the government has been earned and reflected in rising opinion polls for the chancellor and indeed for the governing parties, if I'm not mistaken, but at least for the Christian Democrats. And the outcome, though still horrific as it has been throughout the world, seems to have been based on the idea that if you trust your government and the government then acts on that trust, it kind of works. How do you and yet I look at just to your east, where the pandemic really hasn't reached the extent that it has. And we have very different regime types there, from Poland and Hungary, which we talked about earlier, where there is very divided trust in government, to places like the Baltic states, where it seems to be much higher. How do you look at this?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of trust is key, and Ed's analysis is brilliant on this. Either you gain trust by sort of being convincing, or by enforcing it with power or with sheer force, and that's what we saw in the East. The whole trust issue, nevertheless, is so deeply linked to the anti-rise and side issues of populism we see now for so many years in our Western worlds, where politicians do play with the theme of trust and truth mostly, where they question truth and where they build sort of second levels of so basically existence, where you simply question the existence of someone's facts, and that's what happened now during the Corona crisis as well. The whole debate on wearing masks or not being a political issue is how we see it played out now in the United States. Here in Germany, we had demonstrations out in the streets with sort of nativist movement and people who were questioning the anti-scientific background behind it, because this unity which the country initially showed is now breaking apart. Merkel let loose; she could only hold sort of society together for such and such time. Now this kind of unity is eroding, and so we do see extremely strong forces working within our societies, playing on the theme of trust and truth. And I would have been surprised if someone like Trump or other populists wouldn't have abused this. And the extremely disturbing pictures we see now from the United States with race rioting as well. Again, here the issue of who tells the truth and who's right in what he claims for is questioned again. I think we have to find a way to counter this divisiveness, which those populists basically live from, and probably in Germany found a good way, but it's also nagging here in our societies.
Carol, final word from you. We have about a minute. We've talked about populism versus liberal democracies, where there's greater trust. Authoritarian systems, clearly, Xi Jinping is arguing, we did it. We were able to do it. That's the other way you create trust. How do you see this?
Well, obviously, I'm not persuaded by the authoritarian argument at all. But I think what this moment in the United States has proved is that democracies can be fragile and can be shaken by leaders who undermine everything that we have, truth, science, and we will pay a price in the future. God help us if there were some sort of nuclear crisis, and we had to depend on a leader like President Trump to convince the American people that some kind of counterattack was necessary. It's frightening.
Carol, Ed, Stefan, thanks for your insight. Remarkable set of issues that we had to deal with, and we will continue to deal with. I don't think we solved all of them, but the good news is we will be able to come back next week at World Review to talk about them. Again, thank you so much for being part of this, and we will see you soon. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.